Who's Afraid of Post-Blackness? I just love the title. It has catapulted Toure onto the international stage. He is a leading journalist, critic, and author of 3 books, and has served as a contributing editor to magazines like The New Yorker and Rolling Stone. He is also often seen on television, where he hosts BET's The Black Carpet and appears on an impressive selection of news programs as a cultural correspondent. Never taking the easy route, through traditional education, he honed his intellect, wit, humor, skills, and craft through internships, apprenticeships, and showmanship. Through conversations and collaborations with some of the great Black scholars, public intellectuals, artists, and leaders, he has raised his voice at a time when we needed him most, after the election of the first Black president. Many of you know Toure because he was born here in Boston, and others of us know his parents. After all, Pat Neblett once worked at the museum and helped start our museum store. It is always important to be recognized at home for your amazing accomplishments, and we are proud to welcome him to the African Meeting House this evening. I want you to know that there will be time for Q&A. If Toure repeats your question, it is not because he is pausing to think, but because we want it recorded for posterity. And after the presentation, we will also have a book signing, but I'll be back to close the program. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege and pleasure to introduce Toure.
So lovely, and it's such a beautiful room. I feel like I'm in church, and because we are in a church, and it made me feel like testifying and talking about me and where I've come from. Sometimes I do these events and we get into sociological jargon, that sort of thing, but I felt like talking about me, because this is where I'm from, specifically this institution, as she talked about, my mother worked here, and Boston in particular. And so I wanted to read some of this book that talks about being from Boston and growing up in Boston, some of the experiences that I had around here. Some of you know me, some of you know my parents, so you will remember some of these things, some of these institutions that we were part of. It was really deep growing up in Boston in the 70s. It was a time of very active strife in the streets, busing, and physical attacks. Racism was not this abstract thing. It was a very real, tangible thing. There were places we could not go, and I could not understand that at 5 and 6 years old. What do you mean we can't go to Bunker Hill? What are you talking about? And I understood ostensibly, like, well, bad things might happen there, but in terms of, what do you mean that this is just a place we can't go? We're not doing something about that. So all that formed me and who I am, has formed anybody who grew up in Boston in the 70s and the 80s. So let me read this bit to you about me, and this is going to be the bit that really leads up to the idea that really started the formation of this book, which really lies 20 years ago in an incident that happened in college that shaped me. Because, anything you write is going to have deep roots in your deep past. It's not just going to come from a moment at the beginning of the book. The book begins with the election of Barack Obama and me saying, well, if the highest glass ceiling is broken and actually you can become president, white people will vote for a Black person for president, then what else that we've accepted as true is incorrect. But more than that, there was an incident that happened 20 years ago when I was in college that I had to work through that led to this book. So we're going to lead up through my childhood and get to that moment. I do want to take your questions, but this is not short, because how you become who you are is not a short answer. I am a real and authentic Black man, even though once in a room full of Black people, I was loudly and angrily told by a linebacker-sized brother, "Shut up, Toure, you ain't Black." It was the most humiliating moment of my life, but also one of the best moments of my life, because it forced me to take a searingly painful look inside and figure out exactly what it means to be me and to be black. It led to a liberating epiphany and being at peace with who I am. The moment started me inching down the mental road that would lead to this book. The world had before told me that I wasn't black or wasn't their vision of black, but subtly, never that bluntly. It was, for me, a sort of nigga wake-up call. The fight to figure out who I am has long been intertwined with an internal discussion of what it means to be black, similar to how others struggle with what it means to be Catholic or Jewish, because there's an almost religious aspect to blackness. But in a time when the definitions and parameters of blackness were in flux as radically and rapidly as ever in history, I had to learn to shake free of both the white gaze and the black gaze so I could define myself for myself. We are all a product of the times we live in, and so I've been shaped by the eras of affirmative action, Buffyism, multiculturalism, and post-blackness, as well as living in the shadow of what might be considered Black America's greatest generation, those who fought in the streets and the courts to desegregate and force America to give blacks greater access to the American dream. Because of their struggles and successes, my generation had new opportunities, as well as a certain survivor's guilt. We wanted to fight, but there were no longer battles as fierce and as overt as those they'd already confronted. I had a sense of arriving at the battlefield at the moment most of the hard work has already been completed, able to benefit without having had to fight. So I had greater academic, professional, and personal opportunities than most blacks of previous generations, and a conscious sense of wanting to make the most of those opportunities because people had died for me to have them. I would never be hosed or have to sit in, but racism had not retired, it just got more subtle. So I had different challenges to contend with. I've had to learn how not to be manipulated by modern racism or the cultural bullying that is identity fascism. I also had to keep my self-esteem intact against a plethora of messages that I was of lesser value or ability or of lesser blackness. Racism doesn't often come with a machete these days, but the death of your self-esteem by 1,000 cuts can still lead to the murder of your soul. On the morning of my first day of first grade, as I was about to leave for the private school where I would spend the next 12 years, Mom zipped up my jacket and pulled me close and said, "Remember, you have to be twice as good as those white kids." I took it to mean that I had to work harder and be smarter to get my due, as in they're going to discount my ability because I'm black, so I have to be better in order to get ahead. Yes, I thought like that as a small child because my parents taught my sister and me that being black meant hard work and having to fight to get what was ours. Decades later, Mom explained what she'd actually meant was I had to behave better. Because she thought the teacher would be expecting the black kid to act out. My parents were ascensionists, determined to take advantage of the new opportunities that were opening up for blacks in the 70s. After growing up in working class homes, my father started his own accounting business, bought a house with a yard and a picket fence in a nice middle class suburban community, and sent the kids to a private school. They didn't care about being the only black family in the neighborhood or theirs being the only black kids in their classes. My parents were insistent on ascending to the middle class and having my sister and me go even higher than they had, and they were not about to let anything stop them. After they bought their house on Hart Circle in Randolph, but before they moved in, one of the families on the cul-de-sac started a petition to keep the black family from moving in. None of our other neighbors signed the petition, and my parents didn't let it deter them from moving in. I recall once a small rock flying through one of our windows. My parents did not get all that upset about it, as if refusing to flinch. My parents were also big enough to let the petition roll off their backs. The neighbors who started it had a son my age, and I was always invited to his birthday parties. I always went, and every time his parents were super nice to me. When I was 4 and 5 and 6, I was the sort of kid who would go to a birthday party and spend half the afternoon chatting up the parents. I recall sitting beside their son in the front seat of the car, talking with his mom as she drove a car full of boys to some birthday adventure. It wasn't until years later that I learned of the petition they had launched before I was born. And it shocked me. They'd been so nice. They'd treated me with respect even as a little kid. They didn't seem like racists. Getting my sister and me into a storied private school, Milton Academy, where Robert and Ted Kennedy and T.S. Eliot had gone, was a source of great pride and a fantastic omen for a bright future. It also came with great responsibility. We repeatedly got stern admonishments against embarrassing the race in any way, as if we were personally responsible for the image of every other black person. My parents told us whites expected us to be late, slovenly, and subpar. We were to be articulate, smart, and never ever play the fool. We were instilled with a fear of fulfilling stereotypes. It was not incumbent on others to open their minds. It was our burden to live down the stereotypes. To fulfill them would be a shameful crime. Back then, my parents were quite taken with white approval. If we acted out in public, they'd say things like, "Don't confirm what those white people think. They expect you to behave like buffoons. Trick them." They loved it when white strangers came up to us in restaurants and complimented the manners and behavior of their children. If that happened now, I'd find it patronizing and offensive. So were you expecting buffoonery? Did you also tell that white family over there that their kids are well behaved, or was that not a shock? But my parents appreciated those moments. They didn't look down their noses at traditionally white activities, so we took lessons in tennis and piano and skiing, so that, they said, we could one day more easily socialize with our white peers. There was a small piano and Picasso prints in our house. As role models, they pointed to Arthur Ashe, Bill Cosby, Marvin Gaye, and Ed Bradley until he got the earring, and then it was... Men who were classy, articulate, intelligent, and dignified. My parents were very proud to be black, but they weren't the sort to march in the streets. They preferred being inside players. They preferred Motown to Stax, preferred Ernie Barnes to Jean-Michel Basquiat. They often had lobster dinners for their friends who included black politicians, lawyers, developers, and painters. To me, there was nothing abnormal about a black person going to MIT, becoming an architect, speaking a little French, knowing about fine wine while strutting through life with a persona filled with black tropes, because my favorite faux uncle did all those things. Still, it was impossible for me, as a small child in Boston, to not notice the racism all around me. In the 3rd grade, there was talk of a class trip to Bunker Hill, a place made famous during the Revolutionary War. But it was in an area, Charlestown, my parents felt was dangerously racist. When my mom heard about the trip, she said in a dismissive tone, "Don't even bother bringing the consent form home." There was no way they were going to let me go to Bunker Hill, and I didn't need to ask why. By that point, I already knew there were some parts of Boston that we would not go to for any reason. It was as if nigger-eating dragons lived there. And there was nothing you could do to stop them, so you just avoided them. But there were no supernatural creatures, just people who had automatic hatred for us. They had not met us, but had already decided to hate us so much that we wouldn't risk driving through their towns. As a small kid, I knew not to go to West Roxbury, Lynn, Southie, and a few other places. The knowledge that automatic hatred of you existed just up the road sent a shiver down the spine, and it was depressing. Why did they hate us? Why is it nothing could be done about this? Why was no one challenging or protesting this? But at least all that was up the road in an avoidable place. At school, everyone dealt with race and racism in an upfront and candid way. We talked about it in and out of class, and almost all my classmates and teachers were respectful, open-minded, and non-racist almost all the time. It seemed utopian. I was slapped out of my comfort zone forever in the 8th grade. Students who were in grades 9 through 12 were required to meet each morning en masse for morning assembly. Back then, they separated assembly by gender, so 400 boys met together in one auditorium, while 400 girls convened in a separate one across the street. Late in the school year, all the 8th graders were taken to morning assembly to introduce them to the next year's routine. The first morning that I went with my class of 8th grade boys to sample the assembly, I sat with rapt attention, excited to be among the older boys, as opposed to the semi-slumber you brought to the exercise as an older kid. The assembly consisted of the head monitor, our term for the student-elected student body president, shepherding us through announcements from teachers and administrators regarding school-wide business. Randall Dunn was then the head monitor. He was the school's first ever black head monitor, a brother from Jamaica who did well in the classroom, was on the varsity football, basketball, and track teams, and had tons of charisma. He was respected by teachers and students on the field, in the classroom, and on the quad. Everyone seemed to love him, including the admissions department at Brown, which had accepted him. But a few days before my first assembly, a group of students sat around in the dorm talking with Randall about what colleges they'd gotten into and questioning how it was these monumental decisions were made. And someone said to Randall, with a matter-of-fact, this is obvious tone, I know you're head monitor and you got all this other stuff going on for you, but when it comes down to it, it's really because you're black. Randall was shocked. Here was someone saying to his face that even though he had a fantastic academic profile, one of the best in his class, the bottom line reason he'd gotten into an Ivy was affirmative action. Randall told me that sucked the excitement out of his accomplishment. He couldn't help but feel this was a sentiment felt by much of the school community. He said he felt he deserved the emotional equivalent of balloons, but got shrugs. So that morning in the assembly, Randall spoke to his classmates in a calm, even voice that betrayed no anger and made no demand, but wasn't self-pitying either. He was strong without being attacking, standing his ground and shining a light on some ugliness that was not his fault. He said he knew some students thought he'd gotten into Brown because he was black, and that wasn't right. He'd worked hard and he'd earned it. And then after a brief address, he moved on, but not without casting a pall over the room. I got chills. If this popular, charismatic, athletic, brilliant guy couldn't win the total respect of his classmates, what chance did any black student have? No matter how great you became, even if you were a head monitor with stellar grades and 3 varsity letters, they'd still think you couldn't have earned your way into a good school. Was black skin a cloak of inferiority? Who knew how many people smiled in your face but privately thought, you're black, so you're not that smart, and without the helping hand of affirmative action, you wouldn't even be here. As if affirmative action was proof of your lack of ability rather than proof that when the playing field was leveled, you could excel. When I walked out of that assembly, I felt I had a lot to prove. I knew there was a minefield ahead of me and no way to avoid the bombs. And even if you didn't actually step on the bombs, you were already transformed by constantly having to look out for them. Randall, who's now the headmaster of a progressive school in Chicago, experienced what social scientists call a microaggression. NYU professor Peggy Davis defines them as subtle, stunning, often automatic, sometimes nonverbal exchanges that are put down to blacks by whites. They serve as reminders of purported black inferiority. They include making stereotypical assumptions, being culturally insensitive, and even questioning whether racism exists. One common subset of these microaggressions is something I call the resume check, which is like a descendant of the free papers check that free blacks had to deal with during slavery. A white person basically assumes you do not belong and checks to see if you do. In 2002, I went to Italy to work on my second book at a 2-month writer's retreat that was attended by several college professors. You had to apply to be part of the retreat, and you had to show how serious you were about the project you'd be working on while you were there by getting recommendations to confirm your importance in your field. They only took about 20 people per session. Halfway through my session, several of the professors became nervous, like birds squawking hours before the storm arrives. A new person was coming, Helen Vendler, a famous Harvard poetry professor whose imminent arrival made the professors there nervous. They told me she was brilliant and brusque. They made her sound like a peacock with technicolor plumage who would eschew humility and not only show off the extreme beauty of her feathers, but also point out the lesser beauty of everybody else's plumage. Helen arrived and during her first few days had informal introductory conversations with the others at the retreat. One morning, she and I happened to find ourselves alone on a veranda, and the second question she asked me, with a note of confusion in her tone, was, "How did you get here?" She was clearly asking, how did you earn the right to be here? How did you qualify? Because the demographic evidence doesn't spell it out for me. She was asking about my credentials as if she could not comprehend how a late 20-something black man could get accepted to the same august writer's retreat as her. I felt she was resume checking me. I know she didn't ask all the others there that question, no doubt because she assumed they belong and because I asked them and she didn't. But she was curious to glance at my free papers to make sure I was supposed to be there. By then, I was experienced in being resume checked and all too aware that submitting to it would only suggest that I tacitly agreed that she had valid reason to check me. And later, a tangible wave of shame would come down washing over me. So after she said, "How did you get here?" I paused and said, "By plane." I didn't have to prove my worth to her, even if she was a Harvard professor. Just because she had a master's didn't make her my master. But it took a long time for me to develop the ability to completely dissociate someone else's vision of me from my vision of me. Being a Harvard professor immediately established her as an important person, and we all naturally want the respect of people we deem important. So it takes some hard work long before them and considerable inner strength to have a settled sense of self that would not internalize her message that I may not have belonged. It's easy to think we are in control of defining ourselves for ourselves, but social psychology has long understood that the self-image is constructed in part by how you are viewed by others. George Herbert Mead, one of the founders of social psychology, called this the looking glass self. You see yourself as the world sees you. This is why the constant bombardment of microaggressions can be so pernicious. They bring society's inferior view of blacks to our face and chisel away at our self-esteem. Microaggressions can also serve as triggers for stereotype threat. The idea that when you fear being judged by or living down to a stereotype, that alone is disruptive enough to negatively impact your performance. Claude Steele, the former provost of Columbia University, has done an extensive study on stereotype threat and wrote an excellent book about it called Whistling Vivaldi. The concept is that we're all aware of the stereotypes about our identities. So in situations where you do something that your identity group is negatively stereotyped for, you will fear proving those stereotypes true, and that will cause you to freeze and fail or work harder to disprove them. But that means it's more challenging for you to succeed because you're doing two jobs at once, attempting to solve a difficult task while also battling a stereotype. Using extra mental and spiritual energy fueled by your determination to not fulfill it. Dr. Steele said, people say, why not use the stereotype as motivation to disprove it and perform better? Well, that's exactly what we're doing. We're trying really hard to disprove the stereotype, but when you have to do that all the time, it makes being in an area where you have to do that a lot of work because you're multitasking. You're trying to do the task and trying to disprove the stereotype, and in a lot of situations, that'll backfire and you'll perform worse. You think you're multitasking, but study after study shows you can't. You're not multitasking. You're alternating your attention between the two things, and your performance is going down, and that starts to be frustrating, and that makes the whole thing worse, and it gets to be a feverish situation. I don't think it's something we let ourselves feel. It's something any human being in the situation would feel. It doesn't speak to any kind of predisposition on our part or weakness. It's just rational assessment of the probabilities of the situation. You don't have to have a special weakness to be thinking they could be thinking something about me. It's natural. This is something that black people encounter often. The list of negative stereotypes about us is long, and it touches anyone in a situation where they are aware of a negative stereotype about their group. Malcolm Gladwell talked about a scientific test where he gave black kids the SAT, and then before giving to them the second time, he subtly reminded them they're black, simply activating in the moment their knowledge of their blackness, or that they're being looked at as black people rather than as people. And the second time, they fared worse, far worse. Just reminding people activates these kind of unconscious internalized prejudices, Gladwell said. It changes the way you do the SAT and could make you incredibly cautious. Like, oh, I got this burden I'm dealing with, I gotta make sure, and that's the exact wrong attitude for doing an SAT. And stereotype threat runs across racial and gender lines. Gladwell said, you take rich white kids and you have them jump. You measure how high they can jump, then you bring in a new instructor to do the measuring. But this instructor's black. They jump way less high. The black coach need not say anything to activate the stereotype of whites' inability to jump. The kids already know it. Even Dr. King felt the sting of stereotype threat and was obsessed with not fulfilling certain negative expectations he anticipated. As a young man, he was obsessed with being early, arriving at his classes 15 minutes before they began, and with being clean, inoffensive, and articulate. Michael Eric Dyson said, this is Claude Steele writ large and arguably the greatest American ever. Stereotype threat resonant. Maybe one of the reasons why he plagiarized is because he felt no matter how good I am, they're not going to accept it. Because King is clearly brilliant. He's clearly a genius. And he's even then are extraordinarily rhetorically sophisticated, but still he's got self-doubt. And self-doubt is the product of his vulnerability in a society that doesn't acknowledge black genius. I've felt stereotype threat acutely many times when the whites around me have subtly let me know they're not sure if I'm intellectually up to a certain level of performance expected in a given situation. So then you adopt an I'll show them attitude and you work harder to prove them wrong. But that added fuel isn't always helpful in an intellectual endeavor, and the pressure to disprove a stereotype, moments when you feel you have the identity of the entire race on your back, can make you feel like Atlas holding the world on your shoulders. That feeling makes me admire so much more all those historic black forerunners like Jackie Robinson, Althea Gibson, the Tuskegee Airmen, Thurgood Marshall, and all those who were the first to go to a given college or graduate student. Can't imagine the pressures that they battled. So what do? Ignore your eyes and ears and pay attention only to the voice inside. You need an unshakable self-esteem, an unchangeable self-image, an impenetrable self-confidence that can withstand the attacks you see coming and those you can't see coming, because they seep in like gas. You know you're smart and you belong at Milton or Brown or Harvard or Rolling Stone or Goldman Sachs or wherever it is you've reached, and anything anyone says to the contrary is a comment on them and not on you. Racist attitudes speak volumes about their holders and say nothing about their targets. But detaching yourself from society's view of you is hard work. It's a lesson I learned or an attitude I installed over many years. At Milton, I was painfully aware of being different than everyone, of being other, and sometimes I felt like I was walking around with a giant red marker-drawn circle around me orbiting my body. That was an all but tangible way of feeling racialized after years of experiencing and witnessing microaggressions and racial differences, and perhaps even stereotype threat, even though everyone around me seemed to be going out of their way to try to be non-racist. But still, I was hyper-aware of race. Whites were maybe under-aware of race, but they were still able to be hurt by race. And I learned that the hard way. In my 11th grade American history class, we sat around a large round table that was meant to encourage group discussion rather than having the teacher just tell us what to think. Because we dealt with contemporary issues that many of us talked about outside of class, some kids came to the room like intellectual gunslingers eager to fight. We were young, independent thinkers dealing with hot-button issues like baby chemists handling pyrotechnical chemicals. It's surprising that feelings didn't get hurt all the time. Of course, the most emotional moment of the year involved race, and I was in the middle of it. Reverend Jesse Jackson was then running for president, and 20 years before Obama's victory, to have a well-respected black man be part of the race meant the world to blacks and to me. Years earlier, when I was 6, 7, and 8, my dream was to be the first black president. And everywhere I went, I told everyone. I was fascinated with politics at that early age and studied the history of the presidency so well I could name every president in order, along with when and how long they served and several pertinent facts about them. As a kid, I read Theodore White's The Making of the President in 1960, thinking about how to use JFK's strategic lessons to my advantage. But at some point, the dream faded away. I think around 10, I came to believe that it was impossible for a black person to become president, and I drifted into thinking about what else I might try to do with my life. No other dream replaced it. That dream just faded away. And now that I see I was wrong, it's sad for me to look back at the black boy who dreamed of being president and came to believe the lie that a black commander-in-chief was impossible. It's tragic he thought he was dreaming too high. When I applied to colleges, I wrote essays about wanting to be a political advisor. Talk about dream downsizing. So for Jackson to have taken up my dream and run so far with it was deeply inspiring and meaningful. For blacks to feel as though becoming president was out of the question means an important part of the American dream is off limits. It is American to feel that anything is possible. We have no caste system, meaning anyone could start at any place and reach any level. But before Obama, most blacks felt as if there was a national glass ceiling. We could get rich, but we could not, we thought, become president. And if a crucial part of the American dream is off limits, then we are not full Americans. Jackson's candidacy was doing nothing less than helping to show that it was possible for a black candidate to one day win. Jackson was in the collective mind, working at the far edges where dreams of becoming a black president had died, and the soil was barren and hostile, and he was preparing the land for seeds. So one day the class discussion flowed away from the lesson plan and onto the subject of Jackson, and I ended up in an intense emotional debate about Jackson's political relevance with Sam Williamson. Sam was a whip-smart, egotistical Manhattanite and a national squash champ with all the swagger that dominion over that little world could grant. If there was a young Republicans club at Milton, he would have been president. Sam argued that Jackson was an irrelevant part of the race because he had no chance to win, while I argued that he was relevant because he was bringing issues to the table that would not otherwise be discussed, like poverty and race, and because he was opening avenues for black people to be in the presidential race, which meant further inclusion for blacks in what it meant to be fully American. We jousted, each unwilling to give an inch in front of our classmates, tensions rising as we shot back and forth, locked in verbal combat. It was an intellectual game to him, where to me, Jackson's candidacy was wrapped up in all sorts of racial baggage, partly because I was a boy who'd given up on my dream of becoming the first black president. This is where race can function like a dog whistle. Call it a black whistle. The reverberations emanating from certain names or words or symbols or tropes can be heard only by blacks because of our intimate relationship with the culture. Whites don't hear the same sounds. Sam, unable to hear the black whistle, didn't know he was pushing buttons deep inside of me by asserting that this extraordinary black man was politically irrelevant. By saying that about Jackson, I was hearing him all but say black people were irrelevant. And as we went on verbally punching each other, I felt the sting of racism, though I knew deep down Sam was not consciously being racist and was not meaning to be. Finally, in disgust but not meaning to hurt him, I said, that's what a racist would say. I was not calling him a racist, just saying that he was sounding like one. But I did not then realize that for many white people, being called racist is the absolute worst insult possible. And Sam, the brilliant, arrogant, swaggering kid from Manhattan, began to cry. He bent over into himself and started trembling, and tears spat from his eyes. The room was dead silent. The combustible chemicals had exploded, and if emotions were visible, you'd have seen them splattered all over the walls. The teacher leaned over, she'd happened to be sitting right next to him, and put her arm over his shoulder to comfort him. She looked at me with raised eyebrows and a face that said, "See, you need to be careful where you point that gun." The need for a Teflon self-esteem shield became crystal clear to me in the summer of 1980, when the nation realized that in Atlanta, black boys and girls my age were disappearing and turning up dead. The killings had been going on for about a year when the nation began looking at it as a phenomenon and began collectively freaking out. The way the story developed was in and of itself frightening. For a year, black kids were being killed systematically by some person or group, and not only had no one been caught, but the pattern hadn't even been noticed. That only doubled the sense that black children's bodies were worthless. They could be slaughtered like veal and dumped like garbage, and the authorities weren't concerned enough to even pick up a pattern. The kids were stabbed or bludgeoned or shot or strangled. Most were strangled or violently asphyxiated as if in a lynching. This in the hometown of Dr. King, a city that had a black mayor, a place that called itself the city too busy to hate. If microaggressions were sending a subtle but clear message that the black mind was inferior, then the Atlanta child murders were bullhorns yelling that black bodies were so irrelevant they were killable in bulk quantities. Between July 1979 and March 1981 in Atlanta, 29 black boys and girls between the ages of 9 and 15 were executed. The summer of 1980 was called the Summer of Death. In black households across the nation, it was a terrifying period. Atlanta seemed powerless to protect its black children from the invisible hand snuffing kids out one by one, and no one knew how far across the nation the problem would spread. I was 10, and black 10-year-olds were being hunted and killed. That meant my parents keeping me on a short leash and enforcing an absurdly early curfew. I was locked in the house long before it got dark. I remember lying alone in bed when I should have been outside, my heart pounding, thinking, what if some killer comes through the window tonight? What will I do? It was like living in a horror movie. And deep down, I sensed that this was a symbol for how race operated in America. Black people were like lambs living among wolves. We could be snatched away at any time. We were powerless. Barry Michael Cooper, the screenwriter of New Jack City, interviewed several mothers of murdered boys for a movie project. He says the child murders, both living through them and in interviewing the families of the victims, gave him years of nightmares. He got emotional as he talked about the child murders as a parent of 2 boys. He said, it did a lot to hurt the psyche of black America for a long, long time. There was a tragic sense of loss. There was a sense of national bewilderment, like, what in the world is going on now? They're touching our kids. He recalls some people blaming the parents as if the abductions were the result of poor supervision, but talking to the families revealed a much more frightening reality. The women I met, he said, they weren't bad parents. They weren't negligent. These people came under the cover of darkness, went in the children's bedroom windows, and snatched them out in the middle of the night. They weren't always outside playing and running around at 10, 11 o'clock at night. They were home. Parents talked about going into the room in the morning to get their kids up to take them to school, and the kid is not there. You're talking about Amityville horror, but real. This was vampires, ghosts, ghouls, goblins coming into your house, into your kid's bedroom in the thick of the night and snatching your kids. Eventually, there was a break in the case and an arrest. Wayne Williams, a mentally unstable black man. He was convicted of 2 murders, but of adults, not of the children. He was believed to have committed many of the murders, but few thought he'd committed all of them. And that conclusion left a certain turmoil. Had the serial killer stalking and slaughtering black children been caught or not? Had the real culprit been a black man and not the Klan? Had we just lived through a bizarre embodiment of self-hatred? Was a black man framed to hide a much more sinister truth? And if you did not accept the idea of Wayne Williams as the lone killer, and many do not to this day, then did the government cover up a strange tragedy and let the real killer or killers get away? Perhaps someday more black boys would disappear. So for some blacks old enough to remember the child murders, Atlanta remains a loaded symbol, a black whistle with an ominous sound. 8 years after the last boy was killed, I went to college, to Emory in Atlanta. It brought back some of the senses that I dumped into the word Atlanta as a kid, of the helplessness of black people and the worthlessness of black bodies, but I was determined to be no one's victim and to forge my own path. My freshman year social world revolved around a clique I formed with my white hallmates, an outgrowth of friendships I made in my first days at school, when you're grabbing for any anchor you can get. I was no Oreo, I got along with my black classmates, but spent way more time with my white friends. That was an offense I would pay for later. In the spring of my freshman year, a black freshman pre-med major named Sabrina Collins, a woman I'd never met, very few black students could say they knew her well, made an announcement that rocked the campus. Collins's dorm room had been vandalized. Someone had slashed her teddy bear, soaked her clothes with bleach, and taken a tube of lipstick and written on the wall, "Nigger hang." Next thing you knew, the campus was crowded with news media from around the country who lined the sidewalks trying to interview students, members of the new Black Panther Party marching around, and both the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and the FBI patrolling and snooping everywhere. But the group that made the most noise were the black students who banded together in a way that would have made Dr. King, Malcolm X, and Huey Newton proud, putting what we learned in our African-American political science classes to work. Protesting the incident, the administration, the South, the past, the future, whiteness, everything. We were angry and militant and skipping class to have sit-ins where we took over the student center or the lobby in front of the president's office. Day after day, we kept on protesting because nothing was happening. And even though the whole world was watching, things kept happening to Collins. She got a death threat through the mail. Then she lifted the rug in her room to find "Die Nigger Die" written on the floor in nail polish. That's when she collapsed and was hospitalized for emotional trauma. She was said to have gone mute. We kept on protesting because we saw her as a symbol of all of us. A racist attack against her was an attack on everyone. If she wasn't safe on campus, none of us were. We were fighting back against the same sort of blatant racism our parents had told us about, rather than the more subtle strains we encountered more often in our generation. We knew we had to roar back because this was hardcore racism in the heart of the South. The Klan had a headquarters down the street in Stone Mountain. The child murders had happened here. Almost all the white students were sympathetic to our cause, but we were so politically immature, we barely valued their support. There certainly is some direct evidence, said the county solicitor, and a great deal of circumstantial evidence that would cause one to believe that Collins was the only person involved in these matters. That conclusion came like an unexpected punch to the gut. We'd had the chair pulled out from us by our own Tawana Brawley. This contradicted the script I'd learned about black lambs and white wolves. This was a black person manipulating racism for evil, selfish reasons. It was said that just before the initial incident, Collins had been suspected of cheating in chemistry class and an honors code investigation was being considered. And just like Wayne Williams being convicted of the child murders, once again a serious charge of horrific racism was officially concluded to have been carried out by a black hand. Again, we were told the enemy was not coming from outside the community, but inside it. To me, it seemed that in my generation, racial matters were going to be far more nuanced and slippery than they'd been for my parents. For me, racism was not always a matter of clearly defined lambs and wolves, but more of a double-sided gun. The summer after freshman year, as I caught my mental breath from a turbulent moment, something led me to pick up the autobiography of Malcolm X. He was a central icon for hip-hop and black men of my generation, so it wasn't some obscure tome I was reaching for. It was more like, let me go deep into what it is that exactly makes him so powerful and so widely admired. A few pages in, I could see it. Here was a man with a Teflon self-esteem shield. I had to know how he built it and what he could do for the one that I was trying to construct. Reading that book that summer was like a religious experience. His strength of mind, his laser focus, his black power ideas, his iconoclastic brilliance, his rock-solid self-assuredness that was coupled with an ability to be open-minded enough to change his mind when necessary, and his total lack of concern for the white gaze. This was a role model I craved. Reading about Malcolm was amazingly liberating. He changed me radically and instantly. I switched from majoring in psychology to African and African American studies and made a 180-degree shift in my social life. I left behind my white friends from freshman year and inserted myself into the black community. Now I spend all my social time with black students, always sat at the black table in the lunchroom and got involved in black student organizations. Went to step shows and started trekking over to Spelman and Morehouse to attend their parties. At first, some black students were surprised to see me choose them over my white friends after I'd spent freshman year doing the opposite, but most accepted me without issue. I knew some were whispering behind my back, saying cruel things, call me an Oreo because I'd socialized with white kids freshman year. And it hurt to know that word was slinking around in the shadows behind me, but as long as most of the black students accepted me, I could ignore it. I founded and ran a black nationalist editorial-filled newspaper called The Fire This Time, arranged for Chuck D to come speak on campus, and fought for and won a coveted spot to live in the Black Student Association's small private building that we called the Black House. Junior year, I lived in the Black House, ran The Fire This Time, was an Af-Am studies major, was a regular at every Black Student Association meeting and every party or step show thrown by the Qs, the Alphas, or the AKAs, the Deltas had gotten kicked off campus. And was close friends with the two unquestioned student leaders of the black community. And I wrote a column in the main school newspaper called 40 Inches and a Pen. That was a slow one. But at Emory, where the black community was perhaps still recovering from the traumatic Sabrina Collins debacle, people were very sensitive about what was considered traitorous behavior. So the whisper was still slithering around behind me until the night someone forced me to deal with it. It was around 2:30 a.m. and the party at the Black House was winding down. The music was off and the last 20 people at the party were seconds away from filing out the door. The two other Black House residents and I had previously complained about the aftermath of Black House parties when we were left to clean up, and once again it appeared that other students were about to leave us with a mess to shovel. I had a momentary and not very heated argument with another student about it being unfair that, again, the janitorial work was being dumped in the laps of the Black House residents. And then the linebacker-sized black man from Alabama, who wasn't even in the conversation, who spoke so rarely in public I was unsure what his voice sounded like before that moment, silenced the room by loudly and angrily saying, "Shut up, Toure, you ain't black." I felt as though time had stopped, and I was falling through space. I couldn't hear a thing as all the sound around me suddenly died. I felt the skin melting off my skull as if I was beginning to evaporate from the heat of embarrassment. I felt like a machete was slicing through my mind. I was minuscule, deflated, worthless, nothing. No one came to my aid. No one said that's not right. No one moved to comfort me. They all just stood there gawking as if at a horrific car accident. They all just watched me drowning. I didn't say anything. I just turned and walked away and went into my room as if I could get away from the memory if I just got away from the scene of the crime. I closed the door and vowed to never again think about that moment. It was far too painful to contemplate. This was a memory I had to put in a box. But it wouldn't leave me alone. On the screen in my mind, it replayed in an endless loop. 5 a.m. came and went as I lay there trying to escape, praying for sleep as that memory ate at me. At 6, I got out of bed, went to my desk, and began writing. It was just for me, to help me make sense of what had happened and process the moment so I could put it behind me. I had to ask myself if what he had said was true. It must have been true if it hurt so much, right? Well, it was true by his definition of blackness and of me, but he didn't know me. We'd never even spoken. And giving him the power to define me was no different than giving Randall Dunn's microaggressive dorm mate the power to define him. Why was I working to reject being defined by the white gaze, but not also working to reject definition by the black gaze? Was I going to demand I be defined by me or not? Was I going to build a Teflon shield and reject all external definitions and truly control my own self-image or not? Because I knew I was no Oreo. I made social mistakes as a freshman, but I had always loved blackness. So I wrote about how pathetic his accusation actually was. Who gave him the right to determine what is and is not blackness for me? Who made him the judge of blackness? To say I'm not black is to accuse me of apostasy as if blackness were a religion that could be escaped. But we cannot abandon blackness even if we commit treason against it. It's permanent. Even an Uncle Tom must suffer beneath the boot of white supremacy. And I'm not a Tom just because you don't understand me. I may be a work in progress, but I'll always be black. The only things in life that I am obligated to do are pay taxes, be black, and die. When I finished writing, I realized it was the most honest thing I'd ever written. I said, wow, I'd be embarrassed to publish this. I'd have to hand it in with my eyes closed while the rest of my mind was like, no, don't put that out. And that's when the provocateur in me said, if you're scared to publish it, then you absolutely must publish it. It's embarrassing for you as a person, and that makes it great for you as a writer. He had tried to kill me and failed, and when I decided to own the moment, no matter how embarrassing to me, he lost all power to hurt me. I decided to use the piece in my column in the main school paper rather than the paper I'd founded so it would have maximum visibility. If I was going to put it out, I had to put it out on the biggest stage I had access to. That was the first time I saw what it was like to write something that seemed to set the world on fire. It felt like every single student and professor on campus read the piece and said something about it to me. Almost all of them were impressed. Most of the black students were shocked I'd put myself on the line like that, and I heard the linebacker was mad and embarrassed and wanted to beat me up. I hadn't put any identifiers in my piece, but everyone knew whom I was talking about. But he never did anything. Perhaps because the piece, like my life, wasn't about him. He just made a cameo. It was about me. So that gives you an idea of where I came from. My 14-year-old son goes to Eagle Hill Private School. There's 5%, and he feels that you are too pro-black and too wrapped up in what blackness means, and he has a more diverse world. And I mean, you know, he's at an entirely different stage in his life. He's not even, I mean, really, the sociologists talk about identity formation mode is going to really be from 15 to 25. So he's really just starting to figure out who he is. I'm certain that things will change. I mean, he's in a different generation than we were, than you were, than I was. You know, I mean, things were more binary and separate when you were growing up, when I was growing up. And he's in a world that multiculturalism is sort of an ancient cliche at this point. You know, I mean, it's just accepted that, you know, there will be a certain level of diversity, and that, you know, he takes for second nature that, well, we have Barack Obama, and he grows up with a black governor, and he doesn't really even think anything about it. I'm not sure who he thinks that, you know, that you were supposed to vote for the Republicans. I don't, you know. But, I mean, you know, it's very early in his... What's that? They're not all bad? They're not all bad? No, not all. No, not all of them. No. Nothing is absolute. No, all the, you know. But he will change as life comes to him. I imagine he's probably not had any significant racist incidents happen in his life, or any incidents that demanded he respond as a black person. Yeah. I mean, I've heard that response to the black students feel singled out when they read like a Huckleberry Finn, or they talk about slavery, what have you. But that's just like being noticed for being black, right? It's not really a racist incident. You know, when he has an incident like the Randall Dunn incident, or when he goes to college and they tell him you're not really black, or he gets arrested by the police when he knows he didn't do anything wrong, something will happen that he'll start to say, okay, maybe I'm incorrect. And there's also vicarious racism, right, where we understand that things that happen to other people were intended for us as well. That's why the Randall Dunn incident affects me so deeply. That person didn't say that to me, but I see it happening to Randall, and I understand it's for me as well. A lot of black people talk to me about the pain of watching Hurricane Katrina's aftermath unfold. That's vicarious racism. We're sitting in our homes. Our homes are not flooded, but we feel in deep pain. That's not our family, that's not my aunts and grandmothers, but we feel in deep pain as if it is, and because we know those people are being forsaken because they're black, and we feel just the same pain that they are feeling almost. So perhaps he'll have a moment of that, of finally he'll see, Sean Bell got shot, and that could have been me, or Ayanna Jones got shot, that could have been me, and then he'll start to say, okay, let's hear from the Republicans. He's over there like, come on, I want to get in, come on. Okay. Excellent point. You're just talking about how the younger generation doesn't have the historical context and knowledge of some of the horrors that your generation and your parents' generation went through, and how do we educate them? How do we get them up to speed? Because other people inoculate their kids to what their history is all about. One thing that your generation has to deal with is that you guys were so successful in getting rid of de facto racism that our generation comes into it with an entirely different relationship to America. We come into the affirmative action era. For a moment, in a small way, being black is going to give us a little wind beneath the wings suddenly, rather than being a weight constantly holding us down. And one of the things that I discovered in talking to a lot of the professors that I had not anticipated is they talked about the sense of trauma that attended being black before my generation that does not attend my generation, that we don't have that same sense of trauma, because being black has not been a violent problem for us in the same way that it was for your generation. Look at a movie like, say, The Help, which is set just before I'm born, right, say 10 years before I'm born, and the big lie of The Help is that there's no violence in it, that if they told their story to this white woman, this white girl, a group of white men would have saddled up and killed them, and they would have known that. So there's a violence that you don't even have to do 10 Emmett Tills. One Emmett Till will keep thousands of others in check, right? Which is the genius, of course, of Malcolm X, of standing up in this almost violent paramilitary way that, he's risking death every time he steps to the microphone. My generation is different. And so we have a different relationship to blackness and to America. We're seeing successes, right? I mean, sure, there's great challenges and great problems in this underclass. It's almost permanent. But, we're seeing, in the 80s, we have #1 star on television. In Bill Cosby, we have #1 star in music, Michael Jackson. We have Jesse Jackson running for president. We have Oprah. We have Eddie Murphy. We have Michael Jordan. We have Mike Tyson. We are succeeding at levels, Prince, levels that we had not previously anticipated. And this large class of puppies that emerges nationally, right? We are succeeding at levels we had not anticipated. So we're experiencing it differently than your generation did. And so that sense of almost military-like thing that attends blackness for you because you had to fight civil rights, get the laws broken down so we could just be humans, we don't have that because you fought that battle. So it's not going to be the same. We could study the history, but we're not going to feel the same as you did. In some ways that's good, in some ways that's a loss. I think that we can see people making strides that were impossible to imagine before. I look at part of the beauty and the amazing brilliance of Barack Obama's triumph is that clearly 20 years ago, he said, that's what I want. I want to be president. Clearly, senator was not the goal, right? He wanted to go all the way to the top. And nothing in him said, being black will not allow me to get there. He's like, I'm going to get there, and being black will not stop me. And that's the kind of thing that I see more often in our generation. Yes, there's Shirley Chisholm and Jesse Jackson before him, but Barack Obama approaches it with an entirely different thing. He was never the black candidate. He was the candidate who was here to win. He was seriously playing for all the marbles from the beginning. So those are the kind of things that I think can happen in our generation, and is the difference in terms of how you guys feel and how we feel. And you can't make us feel that. You can't give us that feeling, good or bad. You can't take us back to how you felt, when it was an era of firsts, when you remember Jackie Robinson and how that was. We can't return to that. We can't close that box back. Yeah, I mean, he's talking about just being from Haiti and being treated differently by black people because you're not African American, but you're Haitian American. I mean, it's interesting. One of the things I found is that talking to people who grew up in other countries, be it Caribbean, Canada, they're constantly like, I don't fully get this racial thing that you guys have going on here, because I didn't grow up like that. It's a weird little complex game that you guys are playing, and I don't totally get it. I mean, I would like to see, and I'm not sure how that's playing out. I'm not sure that there's vast changes being made from my generation to the next on this issue. I mean, I think it only makes sense for us to think in a diasporic global perspective, a Malcolm X perspective. I mean, if you take Malcolm X seriously, then you have to think about all black people around the globe are all together. Part of why I prefer the term black to African American is partly because poetically I think black sounds better, it's sharper, than African American, which is a bit clunky. But also, black is global, and it links us all together. We are together with the blacks in Africa and the Caribbean and Brazil, everywhere. African American is a term that thinks it's specific, but it's really kind of vague, right? Because we're kind of talking about black Americans, but now we're not talking about Charlize Theron. How is she not African American? I mean, if you read the African media, they don't differentiate. They're like, our South African sister is killing it in Hollywood, yay! They're not like, well, she's the white one. We really care about Jaimin Han too. No, they love her too. She's African and she's African American, but the black people get all, that's not what we're really talking about. But if you remember, as of course you do, that all people are ultimately from Africa, then everybody's African American, right? Which is, again, that's not really what we're talking about. But I don't see how you don't ultimately look at it that way. So just as a term, it's less specific, and I prefer black, and just to get us to think about, you are a brother just the same as somebody who grew up in Detroit. What is the difference? I mean, look, we can't have a scale, right? Well, she said, what is worse, institutional racism or historical racism? There's no scale, right? It's not like we can pull out like a Geiger counter and be like, well, Sean Bell got killed, so that's a 10, and in this one, some little white kid calls you a nigger, so that's a 1, and we can't sort of, I mean, like the things that our parents and our grandparents went through were extremely pernicious and extremely difficult to deal with, but at the same time, they were very binary. They saw racism running at them down the middle of the street like a bull, and they just were like trying to deal with it, but it's kind of hard to get out of the way because he's really big and fast. And they're constantly dealing with the physical threat of like, we will beat you up, lynch you, kill you, what have you, burn down your home. We don't really deal with that, right? But we deal with something that's much more subtle, right? Like, yeah, I mean, when you're applying for a job, when you're applying for a loan, when you're trying to get a school, when you're trying to buy a house, those are moments that will affect the trajectory of your life. So when you don't get the job, the loan, the home, it's affecting the shape of your life, like where you would have been here in 20 years, but you're going to be here instead. I mean, that's real racism when power comes into play. I mean, we can't compare them, and it doesn't make any sense to compare them, and I don't even like sort of, intergroup comparisons, or like, well, slavery was worse than the Holocaust because that was just 6 million, this was 400 million. Like, it's not valuable. There's no oppression Olympics, right? Where we're gonna like compare and contrast. I mean, you are dealing with the situation that you have, and that's all that we can deal with. Try to find solutions for you to deal with the situations that you're in. But thank you guys extraordinarily.